These are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Lisa White. I'm the Membership Services Manager for the Colorado Municipal League. It's a pleasure to have you here joining us for today's webinar on fraud and embezzlement, what you need to know. Those of you that are elected officials who have registered will receive one university training credit, and the presentation will be available on our website at cml.org under training materials. We are recording the webinar and we'll post the recorded link to the site probably on Friday morning. So if you miss anything or if you have a colleague that you think would be interested in having this information, you'd be able to send them that link at that time. For those who aren't familiar with the webinar format, you'll see a control panel to the top right of the screen. You have an orange arrow to the left of the panel, which will minimize the entire box. All of you will be muted for the webinar, but we encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the question box on the control panel at the end of Patrick's presentation. So Patrick Priest is the Assistant Director and Chief Financial Officer of the Colorado Intergovernmental Risk Sharing Agency, better known as CIRSA. CIRSA is the public entity self-insurance pool for municipalities within the state of Colorado. Patrick came to CIRSA in 1998 with a background in the insurance industry. He began working with insurance entities in 1991 as an auditor with Ernst & Young. He then took that experience to private insurers, including serving as the CFO for Western Farm Bureau. He enjoys the quasi-governmental nature of CIRSA and working with public entities. Patrick is a CPA and serves on the board of Colorado's Public Risk Management Association. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Patrick. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lisa. So as Chief Financial Officer of CIRSA, my responsibilities include not only protecting the resources that our member municipalities pay into our trust, but also to make sure that there's enough to pay claims for things such as embezzlement. When we've had a rise in embezzlement claims in recent years, we started noticing it during the economic crisis, but despite the fact that the economy is beginning to turn around, we're still seeing claims filed. As a matter of fact, just in the last week, 2 claims were filed. So as a result of that, CIRSA has instituted a loss control standard, and when our loss control representatives come out to do their audits, they're going to ask you a little bit about some of the information that I'm going to present in the presentation today. To go through the objectives that I'm hoping that we can cover over the next hour or so, I am going to help you to understand how fraud and embezzlement has occurred at certain municipalities, to identify the factors that allow those employees and officials to violate that position of trust, to learn how municipalities are detecting the fraud and embezzlement when it happens, to learn how victimized municipalities can recover resources lost due to these fraudulent activities, and most importantly, I think, to learn how municipalities can prevent fraudulent activities by their employees and officials. So we're going to start with a case study, and although I did, in anticipation of this, review the claim files for CIRSA claims, it's really, something that's, it's bad PR for the city. It hurts people's lives, and I think the CIRSA claims that I'm going to include is just really going to be anecdotal little pieces as I talk about things. So I picked a claim that's well known. If you type in Dixon, Illinois, embezzlement, you will find in Google hundreds and hundreds of articles and videos. This is well publicized. But it's a community not unlike those in Colorado. Dixon, Illinois is a city of about 16,000 people. It's about 100 miles west of Chicago. It's sort of a regional hub for that little area. It's run by a mayor who's elected and also 5 commissioners. And these are part-time people. They're not full-time staff. They're retired realtors, maybe teachers, somebody that's just interested in local government. But they're not full-time looking at the city and involved in the operations real closely. This city was run by a small administrative staff. At the time that we're going to talk about, there were really only 3 people that ran the city: a city clerk, a comptroller treasurer, and then an administrative person that supported them. They had a water department and streets people and that sort of thing, but really the core of the people that ran the city were those three. I mean, it's interesting. They had no finance officer. They had no full-time accountant. They had no CPA on staff. None of that expertise was available on the staff and really among the elected officials. An interesting thing about Dixon, Illinois is that it's the childhood home of Ronald Reagan. And so in his, I think it was his first year as president, he went back there to celebrate his 73rd birthday. Had a big city parade and everything for him. But it's also well known as being the victim of the largest municipal embezzlement in U.S. history. So let's talk a little bit about it. So as I said, there were only three people, and only one of them took care of all the finances. That was the comptroller treasurer. And this person had been there for years and years and years. Started working in the city hall as a work-study high school student. I didn't really see what they did between the early 70s when this occurred and when they were appointed as comptroller treasurer in 1983, but I don't think it was getting a finance degree. I don't think this was a finance expert or anything like that. Just a well-known person that knew a lot about the city and was appointed that position and had that position for many, many years and gained really a sterling reputation, was trusted. I mean, that was the person that did everything. They trusted what she said. And there was a quote that I saw in one of the articles I did for the research. A commissioner in 2011, so toward the end of when this happened, praised her in one of the meetings, saying she looks after every tax dollar as if it were her own. So it was kind of a telling statement. I don't think it was intended that way. So this person performed this function to the liking of the council at that time for a salary of $80,000. Not a bad salary, but this person lived a very extravagant lifestyle, lived on a ranch, ran a nationally renowned quarter horse breeding operation. And this wasn't just a small operation. These horses won 52 world championships. The comptroller treasurer was named the leading owner by the American Quarter Horse Association for 8 consecutive years. As well as she was doing in the city, she was doing even better in this horse operation. And I think people saw the extravagant lifestyle she led. She had 3 homes, lived on a big ranch, had new cars, had a mobile home that if you look it up, I encourage you to look it up. It's the nicest mobile home I've ever seen. I don't think Taylor Swift has one as nice. Multi-million dollars. Just an extravagant lifestyle. And I think people assumed that she received the money to have that lifestyle from the horses and not from the $80,000 a year she was making. I think maybe they thought, well, this very bright person is helping us in the city and doing it out of the goodness of their heart. We'll never know. But not all was going well. And I have a video clip here from a CNBC show. Again, I said this is a well-publicized thing, and CNBC's American Greed profiled this person a few years ago. Oops. Let's go through. Let's see there. I don't know that it's going to play. We'll see.
Showing horses is an expensive hobby.
Thank you, Lee.
So you're going to need to have some sort of cash to do it correctly.
With their humble background, Cromwell doesn't have enough money to support the boarding, medical care, transportation, and trainers necessary for a world-class breeding program. But as Dixon's comptroller, large amounts of cash pass through her hands every day. According to Assistant U.S. Attorney Joe Peterson, on December 18, 1990, Cromwell crosses a line that will change her life and the city of Dixon forever. She opened a secret bank account in the city's name, and only she has control of it.
She named it the RSCDA account, which stood for some acronym involving sewer, reserve sewer account, but it really was not a legitimate city account at all.
Because Cromwell has full authority to write checks on the city's behalf, it's easy for her to filter government money into the new account.
She was creating fictitious invoices, purportedly representing different projects that were going on in the city that in fact never were going on. And then she would pay the bills. She would pay the invoices and then deposit those checks into the secret bank account.
Okay. I don't have as interesting of a voice as that man. I wish I could be like real dramatic like him. But the next slide is like how did she get away with this? My goodness, this is just dramatic for such a small community. You wouldn't think their budget would be that large. Well, anyway, people that study fraud, and we'll talk about some of the organizations that do so, have philosophies about it. And the main one is the fraud triangle. This is a three-sided model that explains the factors that cause someone to commit fraud. The three sides are: one, the ability to rationalize this behavior. We don't really know, I haven't seen interviews with the treasurer to find out why she did it or why she thought it was okay. But a lot of the things you hear are, people think, I'm not paid enough for the position I'm doing. This company's making so much money, they won't miss any of it. Or I'll return the money after, I pay this bill. So there's something like that has to be going on. And then that's pushed along by some pressure. So that, oftentimes in these situations, somebody's got financial issues. They just went through a divorce. Maybe they have an addiction, something like that, that's pressing along them to do that. I think in this case, probably the pressure was that she really wanted to be a world-class horse breeder. And that was her pressure to keep it going. And lastly, and the thing we'll talk about the most today, is to have some kind of opportunity. They have the ability to do it. And that's hopefully what we'll talk about, and what you can identify and how you can prevent it. I think in this particular case, really trust is one thing that allowed her to get away with this. She was well known, she was highly regarded, and she was trusted. Now, she went to a bank that was just right across the street from City Hall and opened an account in the city's name by herself, where she's the only signer. Yeah, it had an official sounding name, but I think normally a city requires like a resolution of the council, at least the mayor co-signing on it. So she was allowed to do that just to begin with. And then also, I understand that she would just show up and ask for cash withdrawals from this account. I mean, that's highly unusual. And I think, and we'll see in this case with the bank, there was some negligence on the part of some of the companies that you may be trusting to look after your employees and your money. Secondly, she created fake invoices. And when you look at the invoices, they looked somewhat official, and they were for projects and things like that sounded like they were fixing the streets and that sort of thing. The interesting thing was they were for projects that were never done. I don't know who was looking at these invoices and approving them. I believe she was just approving them herself. So I think another thing is people were not verifying the activity she was doing. You could certainly, if you're signing an invoice for $100,000 to repave a street, somebody should go and look at the street to make sure it's paved. The way she would, other than taking cash withdrawals, which is not the normal way, the way that she would divert the funds is she would pay these invoices out of a regular city account that was perfectly valid, and she would have the checks not written out to, let's say, the state who was organizing the project or a construction company. She'd have it written out to treasurer, and then that money was then deposited into her secret account that she was the only signer on. Again, I think that's highly unusual. You should not have checks written to a person. That is something that went on and allowed her to get away with this. I think another thing was that she was a very good talker, and she gave explanations of financial hardships that were accepted without verification. She would sit in city council meetings and talk about budget shortfalls being due to the state being late in forwarding some kind of tax revenues. Few saw financial statements. I guess there was a monthly treasurer's report, which will come up of importance later, but it had very little information on it. And I guess employees really saw no financial statements. And so that's also highly unusual She was allowed to get away with it because nobody was really verifying what was going on or even reviewing it. Another thing that allowed her to get away with it in terms of being trusted is she had a very close relationship with the audit firm that was auditing the city. She served on played on their softball team. She was very close with them. She was known to have big parties. They were invited. And maybe they trusted her a little bit more than they should have. Again, there was a lot of negligence involved. And for the people that you trust to watch the resources of the town, you have to be cautious of them as well. She got away with it by starting small. I mean, she certainly didn't start by stealing $1 million a year. She opened this bank account, and in the first year, 181,000 was found to be taken, and it increased a little bit over time. In 2008 alone, she stole $5.8 million this way. And that's about the size of the total revenues for the city. How do you do this? Well, you borrow money. So they had to build up debt. And how you also do it is by slashing budgets. So she slashed the budgets for the city. She was the one that proposed the budgets and explained what they needed. Employees did not receive raises for years. She would force city departments to make drastic cuts. Apparently, only 65 blocks of road in this city were repaired or replaced in a decade prior to when she was caught. A third of the maintenance staff was laid off because she needed to save money, I guess, to fund her horse operation. So anyway, that's a little bit about how she got away with it, and then how was she caught, I guess is more importantly. One interesting thing to note is over the course of time, and this is just from the scheme of the secret bank account, $54 million was taken. That is the largest embezzlement in U.S. municipal history. And in later years, the amount embezzled equaled the total revenues for the city. So the way she was caught, she was a prominent horse breeder. She would travel around in this luxury mobile home to go to shows and that sort of thing, show her horses. And her backup was the city clerk, who served as acting comptroller in her absence. Again, not somebody that was especially familiar with financial records, but whatever records were going to be prepared for a council meeting, she had to do while the comptroller was out. In the course of that, something wasn't adding up quite right to her, and so she called the bank and she goes, just give me a copy of all the bank statements and I'll figure it out. Well, at that time, the bank and the person that forwarded the information didn't think about it and included the secret account because it appeared as though it was a city account. Well, I mean, it wasn't very well hidden. There were charges in there for like spa visits, vacations, horse expenses, jewelry, that kind of stuff. It was, just blatantly clear. All somebody had to do was to look at that bank statement to know something was wrong. And this city clerk did know, and then went to the mayor, and then the mayor called the FBI. And that's how this all was resolved. Something that if it had happened in the first year, only 180,000 would have been gone, not $54 million. So the FBI asked the city clerk and the mayor to please say nothing and allow this to continue for a 6-month period. I can't even imagine. I don't know if I would be able to keep my mouth shut or to give a stink eye at least once or twice during this period of time. But they sat there quietly, and I basically watched as more money was stolen over a 6-month period. But it was a very smart thing to do to contact the FBI. And here in Colorado, the CBI does that, at least in a lot of the cases that CIRSA has handled, to allow them to build their case, because they need to observe it happening to see how it's going on and to really build all the records. And so they did that, and 6 months later, when she arrived for work, she was met by the FBI April 17th of 2012, maybe tax day, I'm not sure. And she was resistant at first, I understand, but was indicted within the month. Just in the month of May 2012, she was indicted, and she was found guilty in November of 2012. And couple of interesting things. She pled guilty to a single count of wire fraud. So she negotiated. There was not a jury trial. She pled guilty, and because of this, she had to agree to repay all the $54 million, but she's able to get out of prison a little bit earlier. So March of 2030, she'll be eligible to be released. So anyway, so that's the story. That's my case study, and we'll refer back to it a little bit as we go through the rest of the presentation. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to talk about are just red flags, like what could you be looking for to make sure that you catch this early? Again, like I said, if they had caught this in the first year, 181,000 would have been gone. Waiting a couple of decades, it's $54 million. And this chart and a few more that I'll be presenting in here come from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. They have a really great website, and they publish a report. I don't know if it's every year, maybe every other year, called the Report to Nations on Occupational Fraud and Abuse. And this is fraud examiners. It's their job to look at these cases. They're hired to do so. And so they go through all these cases and click off boxes trying to find trends and find out things that appear in all of these cases so that you can be looking for them. And so this first one is red flags. And these are the top 6 factors that were noticed among the people that perpetuated these frauds. Number 1 is living beyond your means. I mean, certainly this treasurer in our case study was a dramatic case, but I mean, just somebody that seems to be going on vacation every year or maybe gambling a lot. I think that's a sign too. You assume they're having gambling winnings, but most people don't win when they go to Vegas. That's a sign. I served on a jury trial one time, or I was on the jury, and that was the case. They were hiding their money by going to Vegas and laundering money that was gotten through. And I guess that's a common thing. The second most common thing is financial difficulties. Not too big of a surprise why you would need to take some money. The third is an unusually close relationship with a vendor or a customer. Certainly, the treasurer had a very close relationship with the auditors. That's another factor that existed in this case study. A wheeler-dealer attitude. I read a little bit more about what that means. What they're saying is it's the kind of person that's always trying to figure out a way to solve some kind of problem. They're going to figure it out, or kind of convince somebody and con them in some way. And maybe that's a sign that they're conning you by taking some money, The fifth is control issues, unwillingness to share duties. I mean, it's a sign that they're hiding something. And then the sixth is divorce or family problems. There are many more factors, and if you're interested, you can go online to their website and see the report. But these top 6 factors were displayed in 79% of all documented cases that they looked at. And there was a note that these are the same 6 factors that have appeared in every single study since 2008. So they're pretty consistent and things to look for. Okay, the next thing to talk about, initial detection. How were these things caught? And it gives you an idea of things you should be putting into place. These percentages add up to 100, so this is what percentage appeared in the cases out of 100. So the top one is tip, and unfortunately I can't see the percentage. My screen is hidden a little bit, but it is about half. In about half of the cases, it was a tip. And what that means is somebody noticed something was amiss, and they told a supervisor, maybe a council person. But the important thing is that it was followed up on, which doesn't always happen. And in the Dixon case, actually, there was some rumors that the treasurer was possibly embezzling some money, and they were just sort of discounted. And so if they had been followed up on, that probably would have been the way that it was initially detected. The second most effective way to detect is internal audit. I know a lot of the communities in Colorado are not big enough to have an internal audit department. Maybe even some of the big metro areas don't have that. I'm looking at the list of people in attendance or that signed up, and I don't know. I'd be curious to know at the end if any of you have an internal audit department, but But that is a good way to do it. And what that is basically staff, and their only job is to check on the rest of the staff. And they usually report directly to the governing body so that they're not influenced by senior management. The third most effective way is by management review. Certainly you need to have good oversight, and people don't just trust that they have some way just to verify. It doesn't mean you have to, hover over their shoulder. They're just reviewing things. Interestingly enough, the fourth most effective way or initial detection method is by accident. Just by dumb luck is better than almost all the other things. Then there's a category of other, just a hodgepodge of things. Account reconciliation, and that's sort of like doing bank recs and that sort of thing. Somebody could write a check to themselves that they're not going to record, of course. And you would catch it by doing a bank reconciliation and seeing it clear the bank. I'd say the Dixon embezzlement was discovered by document examination. Somebody saw the bank statement in question and examined it, and they saw the activity that they never saw before. If somebody had examined that previously, it would have been detected a lot earlier. Another thing that I thought was really interesting, that as far down the list as this is external audit. So your auditors are really not detecting fraud or embezzlement. And when you read the audit reports themselves in their opinion letter, they make great pains to say, free of material misstatement. They put all kinds of qualifications. They're really looking for significant things, that you're recording your financial position correctly. They look at your internal controls and maybe touch on fraudulent things if a red flag is raised, but that's not really their overall purpose. And they do catch it some of the times, and they will perform, fraud examinations if they're engaged to do so. Notified by law enforcement, surveillance, or lower initial detection methods, IT controls, although I think that one will gain as time goes on, just with everything being advanced in the computer world. And then the least effective, confession, maybe not surprisingly enough. But I would say in one of our CIRSA cases that I reviewed, it was confessed. The person confessed. And I thought it was maybe an interesting point is that when they went before the judge and they were prosecuted, I think they got a more lenient sentence than others. And I think the confession helped with that. But it's not a good way to plan for confessions to handle fraud and embezzlement. Okay, so after it's discovered, and I'll tell you another thing that is important is that you're not going to know how much you lost because it's all hidden. And you'll likely have to hire like a fraud examiner or a forensic accountant or somebody to figure out exactly how much is gone. But then after you do that, recovery of losses, how much can you expect to get back? And again, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners has done a study, and they found that in over half of the cases, there is no recovery whatsoever. And then of varying degrees of different percentages, 100% only 12% of the time. A couple of things to comment, though, is that this study is done mainly on just recently closed examinations, or maybe ones that are in process. And so it takes many years to recover, even if you do get prosecution and then restitution through the courts. Our oldest open CIRSA claim was from 1990, and it was an embezzlement claim, and it's only held open to collect the $100, $200 of restitution that we receive every month. And this amount was almost 100% paid off, but I mean, it took all those decades to get the money back. And not with interest. I mean, that's just recovering the amount of money of the judgment. So something to consider. So certainly a recovery is insurance coverage. You can be insured, and the insurance company will provide immediate relief for the amount that you're insured, and then they'll seek the recovery from the person that took the money. And since I work at CIRSA, I will talk about CIRSA coverage. I see on the list of people that many of you are CIRSA members, but I'll talk about what you should look at even if you're not. Your package policy that you have, and CIRSA as well, includes crime, employee dishonesty coverage, usually, but you should look and make sure. CIRSA includes $150,000 of coverage as part of the package. But you do need to look at the limits. 150,000. We'll talk about if that's enough or not enough in a little bit, but it could be higher or lower than that. You also need to pay attention to exclusions. Not CIRSA's policy, but some policies I understand exclude coverage for treasurers and tax collectors, and I mean those are the people that you want to be covered. So you have to be careful for that. If they're not covered or if you don't have adequate limits, you can get a standalone crime or fidelity policy. Through CIRSA, you can buy limits higher than 150,000, up to 500,000, 2 million, and 5 million. And those are placed with AIG, and it's a separate application that you can get. The thing to point out about the blanket policy and the standalone crime coverage is that they are coverage for your municipality as an organization. The application, you're going to fill out what your resources of the city are, some of the activities that you do, and they're going to evaluate it based on your city. Another option is to get a public official bond. Now that's coverage for a particular individual. You're going to be bonding a person. And that's when they exclude coverage for tax collectors or treasurers. What they want is you to get a public official bond. And the reason why they want that is because, of course, the risk is higher for them. And they want the application to be for that person. So the applicant has to submit their financial statements, submit to a credit check, and then the insurance company is going to evaluate them individually. And really for the purpose of saying, if you do take money, we want to know that we can get it back from you. And so they will reject people if they don't have good credit or if they don't have the resources. And certainly financial problems being a red flag that we talked about, it would certainly be a bright red flag if they can't get a bond. And certainly probably a best practice would be to not allow somebody to serve as treasurer if they couldn't get a bond. And public official bonds aren't required everywhere, but they are required by local charter or ordinance in some Colorado municipalities. Okay, and then paying attention to your limits, you need to consider how much money you've got running through the city and what you think your risks are. 150,000 may be enough for a small community in the mountains, that has a $100,000 budget for the year. But maybe it's not. One of the largest claims that CIRSA has, the operating budget for the town was like $75,000, and the town clerk took over $400,000 over the course of 20, 30 years. A story not very dissimilar to the case study that we studied. And so that town didn't feel that they needed to buy excess coverage, and so they were really only covered for the $150,000. And they did get no recoveries because this person, when they were caught, committed suicide and left without sufficient assets. So it's something to pay attention to. And not to be a sales pitch, I was told not to make this a sales pitch, but excess crime is a really inexpensive coverage. I looked up just to see how much our CIRSA members pay. The very largest metro area city that has a hundreds of millions of dollars in their operating budget probably pays less than $3,000 a year. So it certainly is worth consideration. Okay. Now, the last part of the presentation, we're going to talk about what to do to make sure you don't have to worry about insurance coverage or recoveries or detecting red flags, and it's in preventing the fraud embezzlement from beginning in the first place. And this will be kind of a technical thing that I'm going to go through really quick. It's probably worthy of a whole day presentation on its own, but I'll give you some resources at the end that you can refer back to. The most important thing to prevent fraud and embezzlement is to establish a comprehensive framework for internal control that will not only prevent fraud and embezzlement from occurring, but it will also detect it quicker if it does occur, which is important. Remember, the highest dollar fraud and embezzlement claims are due to the length of time they occurred, not necessarily that it was taken all at once. I mean, you're certainly going to notice $54 million going all at once. But if it's being taken over a 20-year period, it can be hidden better. And so there are people out there, and all they do is establish frameworks. And so The most renowned one is the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, or COSO. This is an organization comprised of, the top professional organizations: the American Accounting Association, the American Institute of CPAs, Financial Executives International, the Institute of Management Accountants, and the Institute of Internal Auditors. And they got together and they came up with, which is really the gold standard of internal control, the Internal Control Integrated Framework. It was just recently revised and expanded from their original version. I think was issued in '92, and this one came out in 2013. And in this version, they identified 5 essential elements, and we'll go through those, 17 principles, and one of the principles they added that wasn't in there originally relates to fraud. The principle states that the organization considers the potential for fraud in assessing risks to the achievement of objectives. So that was something that was added just recently, just a few years ago, and so we'll go through that over the next few slides. The Government Finance Officer Association makes this a best practice to implement according to this framework, and they have guidance to tailor it to local government to make it easier to understand. I referred quite a bit in my preparations for this to their publication, An Elected Official's Guide to Internal Control, which they published in 2015. It is a real brief little booklet, I don't know, maybe 30 pages long of large print. They don't even fill up every page. It costs $5 for GFOA members on their website. And this is specifically designed to offer non-specialists, be they a counsel, a staff member without accounting or auditing expertise, or even a citizen that's asking you questions, the information they need to understand what internal control is, how it operates, and who's responsible. And I'll give you again the web address where you can order that. These are all pretty, or I think I skipped over the Fraud Risk Management Guide. So the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners got together with COSO, and they put together a Fraud Risk Management Guide that takes the framework that they put together, and specifically focused on fraud, identifies how you can identify fraud within that framework under each element. Again, a comprehensive document, and something we were not going to go through in any kind of detail, but I'll refer you to how to get a copy for yourself. And then the last thing, like I talked about, CIRSA in, let's see, what year was it that we did that? That's being covered up right now, 2013? 2014, we instituted a loss control standard. For those that are members of CIRSA, you're subject to a loss control audit every year where we ask you things about, how do you prevent trips and falls, and, different risks like that. We added financial risks because we had noticed a rise in embezzlement claims. And so I was asked to put together a questionnaire. I was told I had to keep it to 1 page, and it took me a long time to figure out how to cover all of these things. If you could see the integrated framework guide in my 1 page, you would see it was amazing that I was able to do that. But that's a checklist that your loss control representative will go out and ask you to fill out. And I'll go through that a little bit so you can find out how to comply with it. Certainly, if you are studying, GFOA's guidance and COSO guidance, you're going to be able to meet CIRSA's standard. Okay, so let's get into it with element 1. And they define that as the control environment. You need to have a good control environment. And the way you do that is by having a commitment to integrity and ethical values, independent oversight, assignment of authority and responsibility, competent staff, and accountability. The main thing you hear, the thing you hear people say a lot is that there's a good tone at the top. And you as elected officials, city managers, town administrators, you need to present yourself as that you are there to do the right thing, and that you are setting good policies in place, sticking to them. I think in local government, independent oversight is somewhat built in because we have elected officials. You don't know who they are. And I think another thing to point out here that I think is important is competent staff. I noticed a trend in a lot of the CIRSA claims I looked at, not that they were incompetent staff, but that, somebody left, there was a 2-month period before a new accountant was hired, and in that 2-month period, bank accounts weren't reconciled, people weren't looking at the credit card statements, and that's when the fraud happened. And they were caught right away after somebody was put in place. But under competent staff is having a good succession plan, having good backup, and that's something that you should really be looking for. Another thing to talk about with staffing is accountability. When you read the guide, it says you need to hold staff accountable. That's true, but you can't put excessive pressure or demands on them, because once you do that, you're creating that pressure. That's one of the sides of that fraud triangle, creating something that's causing them to perhaps push them to fraud by putting excessive pressure. From the risk management guide to achieve a favorable control environment, let me read it to you. The organization establishes and communicates a fraud risk management program that demonstrates the expectations of the board of directors or council and senior management and their commitment to high integrity and ethical values regarding fraud risk. At CIRSA, one of the things that we do is we have each member of our board and each new employee, no matter who they are, sign a conflict of interest policy that we've established that sort of defines what we consider right and wrong. Has to be signed. You're given a copy of it. And one thing that we do, I think, we set policies within our purchasing policies. We indicate, when you have to do RFPs and that sort of stuff. So things like that, you don't necessarily have to write a whole new policy about fraud management, especially for a small organization, but there are things that you can think about. And then to meet CIRSA's standard, I brought that with me. I think ours just says, to meet our standard, the governing body and senior management must commit the appropriate time and other resources for effective internal controls. Let me see, I brought my one-page questionnaire. I think the other one, too, is on our CIRSA questionnaire. We asked, do you perform background checks on all your new hires? I don't think everybody does that, and you should. I mean, that's probably part of competent staff. And then also assignment of authority and responsibility, another thing that we go through several things to make sure that senior management has established a clear structure of authority and responsibility which segregates incompatible duties. Things such as, is the employee who approves purchases different from the employee who signs the checks or otherwise disperses the funds? And if you're a really small place with only one person, is there a second person verification for those activities? So some things like that you should have in place. Okay, the second element is risk assessment. To be effective, risk assessment should be ongoing and not a one-time event. Also, it should possess the following 4 characteristics. You have to specifically identify your objectives. You can read all those guides, but they're not going to tell you what you need to do for your town. So you need to think of that yourself and identify the specific risks that you have. You need to identify what those risks are. And I put an example here of one that I came across kind of recently, is especially as it relates to fraud. And certainly the highest risk of fraud is cash. And a lot of our cities and towns in Colorado are now getting a lot of cash due to marijuana taxes. And so I reached out to a couple of entities that do this and asked how do they deal with this risk. And it was kind of interesting. So there are policies in place in their other communities. When they do collect cash, they have people that are assigned that they have to be the ones that count the cash. It's all documented. They hand a receipt back to the person. 2 people do it. They sit in a private room. Often they are under surveillance, video surveillance or something like that. The cash doesn't stay at the city very long. I mean, that's certainly a risk of, not only your employees, but somebody learning about that and trying to break in. So get it to the bank right away. One community I thought was pretty wise. They said, we won't take your cash. You have to go get a cashier's check or money order and make somebody else be subject to that risk. Um, and then I also learned from a couple of entities that there are some banks that are now allowing them to open accounts. I don't know, they didn't say who they were, but apparently that's starting to change a little bit. And so hopefully this risk will go away. But if you are somebody that's collecting a lot of cash, that's definitely a risk that you should be looking at, identifying what you need to do, and be alert to fraud. Um, so let's see, under identification and assessment of changes, again, that goes back to this being ongoing and not a one-time event. And I wanted to use as an example, at CIRSA, we just changed our claim system, certainly a major system for an insurance entity. And we changed from a computer system based in-house on our servers where we had controls over all that to a cloud-based system where more things are automated. And there are different risks and things that you need to consider as you protect that data. And and we've done that. So it's definitely something that you, as a big thing is being changed, you need to go back to what your risks you assessed and consider whether something should change. And then under the fraud risk management guide, um, the organization performs comprehensive fraud risk assessments to identify specific fraud schemes and risks, assess their likelihood and significance, evaluate existing fraud control activities, and implement actions to mitigate residual fraud risk. A fancy way of just saying everything I just said. And then in the CIRSA questionnaire, we don't really address fraud specifically. We don't mention that word, but we do talk about controls limiting physical access to assets, like the cash that we talked about, and accounting records. You want to make sure nobody can get to the accounting records to hide the fraud that they did. You got to keep that safe. You should do inventories of your assets. Several of the CIRSA claims came from police departments and people taking evidence and pawning it, taking weapons and that sort of thing. That's a pretty common claim. And so you've got to keep an inventory of things that are held in police evidence and have one person that's in charge of it, keep a log of who sees it and that sort of thing. Some basic things that you can do. All right. Element 3 is control activities. And effective control activities include selecting and developing the appropriate controls over the risks that you identified, general controls over technology, making sure the password isn't password for everybody in the city that knows to get into the accounting system, and setting policies and procedures. And I think also updating them regularly. We're updating some policies at CIRSA, and you'd be surprised at how fast things change with things moving to the cloud, using credit cards more, purchasing cards, electronic disbursements. You've got to keep policies and procedures current. In the fraud risk management guide, their guidance, just the summary of the guidance is, the organization selects, develops, and deploys preventative and detective fraud control activities to mitigate the risk of fraud events occurring or being detected in a timely manner. And to talk a little bit about the difference between preventative and detective activities, I think a good example is P-cards, which is something being used more and more now. Now remember, when you give somebody a P-card, they have the ability to buy something with that without asking you anything. And so a detective activity is that you're reviewing a expense report afterwards, the manager's approving it, maybe they're audited by somebody to make sure they're coded right, or they meet with the policy or that sort of thing. But there are some preventative things to prevent somebody from spending in a way that is not approved. And one of the claims that CIRSA had, the person used their city-issued credit card and got cash withdrawals in Blackhawk to gamble with. And so I put a control on our CIRSA P cards that you can't get cash withdrawals at all. And I don't know, maybe in your city you have a good reason for that, but that seems like a pretty good control to me, that you don't want people just to have cash. And then credit card companies are big, huge, behemoth companies that have all kinds of technical ways to prevent people from spending in different ways. And so liquor stores have a code associated with them. You can say, this card cannot be used to buy anything at a liquor store or at a pot shop, or you can't use credit cards at a pot shop, but that sort of thing. So that would be a preventative control that you could put in place. I see my time's almost up, so I'll go kind of quickly through the rest. Element 4 is information and communication, and this is making sure that the program that you spend so much time to identify and design is communicated to the people that need to know about it. So certainly the staff that you assign to serve a role within your internal control environment should understand, why are they doing this and what's its value. I think a lot of times internal controls slow down a process. Having to get an approval makes it quicker than having to just go buy it yourself. But there's a very good reason why you need to get an approval to make sure it's proper. So explaining to somebody why they're doing the procedure, how it fits with an internal control, is probably very valuable. You need some way to communicate to both internally and externally. Hotlines are one way to do that, and following up on it. I know at CIRSA, we mail to each one of our members a copy of our audit report every single year. That's not specifically on internal controls, but it is our full financial position and whether or not it's fairly stated by an auditor. And so that's one way that we communicate that. I think that's all. I can skip over the rest of that. Monitoring. This is the last element that really comprises all the others. It says that once you've put all this in place, that you're constantly looking at it, a formal process to stop, reevaluate, is it effective, should you change something up, and putting some sort of formal process in place for that. Certainly I put in the internal control questionnaire, when you get an audit, just a normal financial audit, if during the course of the work, the auditor finds something that they refer to as a material weakness or significant deficiency, and those are technical words, that means your controls they don't trust them enough to produce accurate financial data. And they will issue a letter called a management letter that'll detail what they found and what the problem is. And they're going to put a qualifying opinion on your financial statement, maybe saying, we can't really verify that these numbers are right. If you get one of those letters, you really should follow up on it. That should be presented to the council, and the council should see what it is, and there should be a formal response that's reviewed by everybody and understood. And surprisingly enough, we have had cases where CIRSA members have had that, and their response is kind of like, well, I don't care. We don't like that. That would take too much time. So don't be that way. All right. So that was really quickly going through something that's very complicated and maybe discouraging to you that it would take too much work to do. So for more information, I really encourage you to start with the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and their website is listed here. They produce that report to the nation that'll scare the heck out of you of the things that could go wrong. I know one of the overall things that they talk about is that they estimate 5% of all corporate revenues are lost to fraud. I don't know if that's different in governmental entities or not, but it was just an interesting fact and surprising to me. The Committee of Sponsoring Organizations has a website where you can buy all kinds of literature regarding the internal control integrated framework, the joint publication with the certified fraud examiners on fraud risk management. Those are for purchase, and they're a couple $100. I guess to point out, both of these sites also offer training and webinars if you wanted to look at something in particular. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiner website, you can find a fraud examiner. So there's a way that you could hook up with one if you need that. And then the Government Finance Officers Association has something a little more tailor-made for local government. They have some best practice documents that are often just 1 or 2 pages long. The publication I mentioned is available on there, and there is their website. And the best practice documents are free. The publication that I mentioned is only $5, so that's definitely a good place to start. And then I didn't have room to fit it. So here's my contact information there. You could certainly ask me any questions. If you're, a CIRSA member and you want to know how to comply with our standard or any questions, I would encourage you to call.
Wow, thank you so much, Patrick. What great information. So, CML totally appreciates our relationship with CIRSA and highly recommends them for any of your needs. So highly encourage you to reach out to Patrick. If you have any questions at this time, go ahead and type them into the question box. While you're doing that, of course, I'm going to take this opportunity to remind you about the annual CML conference coming up June 20 through 23. Going to be in Breckenridge this year. Amazing program we have in place, and you can actually go to the website cml.org under annual conference and take a look at our preliminary program. You'll see the various sessions and topics and speakers that are going to take place, and we think it's obviously going to be a tremendous opportunity. Any questions coming in yet? Okay. Wow, you were very thorough, Patrick.
Okay, thank you very much.
Again, if you think of anything afterward, reach out to Patrick. He'll be happy to help you. Thank you so much for participating, everyone, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon.